reading from the 4th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. Now when Jesus heard that John had been arrested, he withdrew into Galilee. And leaving Nazareth, he went and dwelt in Capernaum by the sea, in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali, so that what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled. The land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, toward the sea, across the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles, the people who sat in darkness have seen a great light. And for those who sat in the region of the shadow of death, light has dawned.
Having learned more about the original context of Isaiah, I'm curious to hear maybe how did you hear that gospel lesson differently than you might have otherwise, as well as that corresponding bass air and recitative from Handel. Who were those people that walked in darkness? And when did they see a great light? And what was the light? Was the light Jesus in the first century? And was the darkness Rome? Or was the darkness the Syro-Ephraimite crisis and the light the newborn crowned prince? The conservative Christian tradition of my childhood taught me that Isaiah was basically the fifth evangelist. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Isaiah. And when a gospel writer quoted a passage from the Hebrew prophets, that I should think, isn't it amazing how that ancient prophecy predicted details about Jesus' ministry? But the more I explore the original context of the Hebrew prophets, the more I think that Isaiah would have been dumbfounded by Matthew's interpretation of his words. And Isaiah's understanding the fruit of his prophetic speech was borne out in his lifetime. Isaiah told the reigning king of Judah that he should place his hope in God and in the future descendants of David, specifically the newborn crowned prince. But Hezekiah chose to ignore Isaiah's warning and instead attacked Assyria. He was, if you were wondering, spectacularly unsuccessful. The Assyrian counterattack ravaged Judah and besieged the capital of Jerusalem. I can imagine Isaiah saying, we have no record of this, but something along the lines of, "Thus saith the Lord, I told you so." Isaiah spoke a prophetic word. The king ignored it. So from Isaiah's perspective, the shelf life of his prophetic speech had expired. Isaiah would be shocked if he somehow found out that someone had applied his prophetic speech to a situation 800 years after his death. So what is Matthew doing? Matthew says that Jesus, quote, left Nazareth and made his home in Capernaum so that what had been spoken through the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled. He then quotes the first two verses of Isaiah chapter 9 about how the gloomy and anguished Zebulun, Naphtali, and Galilee, that there will be a great light for those who have lived in a land of deep darkness. Matthew's leaders would have known that Nazareth, which he has Jesus leaving, was part of what used to be called the tribal territory of Zebulun, and Capernaum, where he was said to be going, belonged to what was known as the land of the Naphtali tribe. And that both Nazareth and Capernaum were in the Galilee of the Gentiles. But this raises the question of whether Jesus decided to leave Nazareth and go to Capernaum in obedience to this prophecy from Isaiah. And I increasingly think that Jesus did not consult Isaiah as a playbook in quite that way. Nevertheless, it is important to emphasize that Matthew wasn't stupid, nor did he think that the intended audience for his gospel was ignorant. Instead, Matthew was extending a trajectory of scriptural interpretation that was already well established. Even though Isaiah was only speaking to his immediate context, later Jewish interpreters between Isaiah's time and between Matthew's time and those centuries in between had often applied Isaiah's words to the Jewish kings in their own day, who faced similar situations to that of Hezekiah in the 8th century. Later Jewish interpreters even applied Isaiah's words to the expected Messiah, though that was understood in different ways. So when Matthew applied Isaiah's words to Jesus, he was continuing a direction of interpretation that was already in place of reading backward from one's own context and interpreting the words of long-ago prophets as applicable to one's own present-day experience, irrespective of the original author's intention. Matthew was unconcerned with Isaiah's original intention. In Matthew's day, there was no New Testament. He wasn't submitting to the New Testament board for publication. And even now, even then, in the first century, what we call the Hebrew Scriptures was only 2/3 complete. So when Jesus references the Jewish Scriptures, he talks about the law and the prophets, the Torah and the prophets. He doesn't talk about the Tanakh, because a whole third of the Hebrew Bible was still not complete for about 200 years after Jesus' death. If pressed, Matthew, as well as other similar interpreters, might have said that this way of reading meaning backward into the Hebrew Scriptures, that it actually exposed a deeper meaning of the Scriptures that had always been there, even if the original authors didn't realize that it was there. It was there, and now you know, because Matthew has written this book. Even though it had nothing to do, again, with what the original author thought he or she was saying. So one could argue that this is one among many possible legitimate ways of reading Scripture. But when this particular way of reading the Hebrew Bible is multiplied again and again over the last 2,000 years by Christians, you can begin to sympathize with the Jewish complaint that in regard to the Christian use of the Hebrew Bible, Christianity stole our watch and for the last 2,000 years has been trying to tell us what time it is. And when this direction of interpretation is continued, especially without close examination of the dynamic that's going on, the result is Christian appropriation of Jewish scriptures and traditions without any reciprocity and without any accountability. So how do we read and approach the Bible more responsibly in light of this awareness, especially after the Holocaust, and a greater awareness of the ways Christianity has contributed to anti-Judaism through the centuries? To begin to respond to that question, I want to return to some of the differences in translation that you may have noticed between the Jewish translation of Isaiah 9 and the translations you may be more accustomed to hearing. The most recognizable differences are not in the first two verses of Isaiah chapter 9, which is what Matthew quotes, but verse 5, which is never quoted anywhere in the Christian New Testament. It was instead made famous 1,700 years after the New Testament by George Frederick in The Messiah. He shall be called Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace, as the choir belts out in The Messiah. A much better translation of that verse, so it turns out Handel wasn't that great at Hebrew, and when you look at the Jewish Publication Society of those verses, they translate it this way: the mighty God is planning grace, the eternal Father, a peaceable ruler. Jews are monotheists who have studied their scriptures closely, and it's unreasonable to assume that the Jewish people failed to notice that Isaiah's prediction was that the human Messiah would be called the mighty God, because that would be a problem if you're a monotheist, right? Having a Messiah that's human and called the mighty God, the everlasting Father. And what Isaiah is actually describing, which you see in the much better translation of the Hebrew by the Jewish Publication Society, is that Isaiah is talking about the throne name of that 8th century crowned prince. That young child was given a name that means the mighty God is planning grace through this child. The eternal Father is hope for a peaceable ruler. And that throne name is a symbolic way of describing the kind of king that crown prince was hoped to be in the Davidic line, as well as the kind of God that king was thought to represent. Matthew, however, was not concerned with the 8th century BCE. He was concerned with the 1st century. He was concerned with using Isaiah's words to support Matthew's understanding of Jesus. But what about us? In what direction should we read the Bible? I invite you to ask, when you read the Bible or other scriptures, does your interpretation lead you backward to the Hebrew Scriptures? Does it lead you forward to other parts of the Christian tradition? Does it lead you sideways, out of yourself to connect and care for your neighbors? Does it lead you downward to connecting and helping the poor? And whatever scripture you're reading, whether Jewish or Christian, Buddhist or Hindu, or the latest issue of the journal Science, if that is scripture for you, my hope is that you will be attentive to the undercurrents of your interpretation, where your interpretations lead you. One of my favorite guides for interpreting Scripture comes from the Yale New Testament scholar Dale Martin, who argues in his book, The Pedagogy of the Bible, that we citizens of the 21st century must own that we know too much now, And we must own our responsibility for the truth, the goodness, the morality, and the social effect of how we interpret the Bible or any other text, sacred or secular. People throughout history have used the Bible and other scriptures to affirm and to argue for and support slavery, as well as emancipation, to support sexism, as well as equality. The same text, violence and nonviolence. And if your interpretation leads to more violence, oppression, and inequality in this world, instead of more liberation, justice, and peace, then reader response critics such as Martin invite you to consider that the responsibility is much more on you, the individual interpreter, or much more on why have you chosen to be part of an interpretive community that teaches you to read scripture or to read text in a way that increase violence and inequality and oppression. You could similarly say that it is illegitimate for anyone to blame the Bible, the Quran, or any sacred book for their hate, their apathy, and their vengefulness, just as it is illegitimate to blame racism, sexism, heterosexism, or any other oppression on Scripture. We know too much in the 20th century. We know too much to let ourselves off the hook that easily or to let other people off the hook. If your interpretations do not lead to more love, compassion, forgiveness, mercy, and grace in this world, what Paul called the fruit of the Spirit, that if we're acting with the Spirit, what we call the Spirit of life, then that leads to love, to joy, to peace, to patience, to kindness, to goodness, to faithfulness, and self-control. That's how you know that you're manifesting the Spirit of life in your reading of text and in the world. And if that's not the case, then your interpretation is irresponsible and should be denounced. We all pick and choose, liberals and conservatives. And if you pick and choose, why not choose love? In the words of William Sloane Coffin, the world is too dangerous for anything but truth and too small for anything but love. And I'm grateful to be with you in this tradition of Unitarian Universalism in which we seek together to stand on the side of love. Now, we don't always get it right. We seek to build a diverse, beloved community, drawing from 6 sources, and sometimes we have conflict. Sometimes we don't always get along. But then we have to choose again to stand on the side of love, of telling the truth, speaking the truth in love, and choosing forgiveness and reconciliation. So in that spirit, as we seek to reflect on what that means, I invite you to take your teal hymnals and turn to hymn 1037. You can remain seated. We're going to sing together this hymn that I'll say the written part, and then we're going to sing together this repeating verse that invites us to begin again in love. The words are the same for the parts you're going to sing, but you'll hear the tune is going to slightly change.